Orders of the day. I recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Order G214, please.
Order G214, resuming the debate adjourned on October 29, 2024 on the motion for second reading of Bill 214, an act to amend various energy statutes respecting long-term energy planning, changes to the Distribution System Code and the Transmission System Code, and electric vehicle charging.
Further debate? I'm pleased to recognize the member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm pleased to speak in this House. I always am, but I have to say I'm not pleased by this bill. As you are well aware, Speaker, all governments are imperfect, and I would argue this government is more imperfect than most. If you are a person who is trying to balance your budget, if you're a person who's trying to cover your household bills, worried about your electricity bill or your gas bill or your insurance bill, worried about what you're paying for groceries, then I have to tell you, you are not going to be happy about this bill, notwithstanding its title, which I have to say should be recognized as an act of creative genius, given how little it actually applies to the legislation before us. The bill that's been introduced is deeply flawed, and I want to touch on some of the key issues, and then I'm going to go into some depth. First of all, I think we all recognize that Ontario's energy needs are growing. Not a question. And now, more than ever, we need a government that keeps the focus on affordability, reliability, and sustainability. You may or may not be surprised, Speaker, to find out this bill doesn't require that those factors are actually taken into account in the plan that this bill will provide a framework for. They may be touched on, but they don't have to be addressed in the plan. Any serious energy plan needs to shift to non-emitting sources and stop the over-reliance on gas as we confront the impacts of climate change. That's not in this bill. And if you're worried about higher grocery prices because drought or flood are affecting the crop-growing regions of North America, this bill is not one that's going to help protect the price of food in future, because it's not one that explicitly uses the energy system to meet our climate goals and help the rest of the world protect itself. When it comes to large infrastructure projects, this government's track record raises serious questions, especially on transparency and financial accountability. And so I would ask, when was the last time anyone in this building took a ride on the Eglinton LRT? Or when did you last hear of a completion date for the Eglinton LRT? Delivering the goods and being open about what's going on, not the forte of this government, and that is reinforced in this bill. Now, with the right energy plan that's grounded in evidence, and I have to emphasize grounded in evidence and transparency so that the public can actually see the basis for the decisions that are being made, and with the expertise of workers in the energy sector, and we have a very sophisticated workforce here in Ontario, people who are second to none globally, we can ensure that our province has the energy we need for a thriving economy and the low-carbon future ahead of us. And it is key, Speaker, that we actually make sure that we continue to invest in the workers who develop our energy systems and support them in doing the critical work that they do to make sure the lights are on. However, this bill takes us in the wrong direction when it comes to transparency and depoliticizing our energy planning decisions. We've seen it before. We saw it under the Liberals, that politicization of energy planning was one of their signature calling cards. That was a huge problem, and this bill reinforces that Liberal tradition of ensuring that things are not properly examined and that evidence is not presented, made available to the public. We've seen the dangers of politicized energy policies from previous governments, and this bill's attempt to cut out the independent regulator takes us further away from a future where energy policies are based in evidence and transparency. Again, I would say with that direction, this government is the true inheritor of the Liberal tradition. Time and again, we've seen this government push legislation forward, that takes away guardrails and accountability. This bill is no different. Bill 124, as an example of a bill that actually didn't look after the people of this province, that did not actually reflect the legal framework that we operate in. This is a government that does not think that protection of your legal rights under our Constitution or Charter are really significant matters. There's no question, Speaker, that our energy needs are growing. But you have to be very careful about how you plan for meeting those needs and how you deliver. And we've been here before, Speaker. Ontario has previously heard projections of huge growth in energy demand and found that the projections fell far short of reality. Now, I am saying there will be more electricity demand. There's no question. We are moving away from fossil fuels, from oil and gas and coal. And as we do that, in the operation of our economy, people will be using more electricity. We're going to see enhancements, growth in digital capacity in Ontario. That will require more electricity. But the question for all of us is the need to get it right. It will be critical to avoid overbuilding because that's very expensive. And everyone who's gone through the experience of the last 2 decades under the Liberals will know from their wallets how expensive that is. We've all experienced that. On the other side, and there's no doubt about this, underbuilding is a problem because then we face supply problems. As Yogi Berra has been quoted saying, prediction is hard, particularly about the future. And that is the difficulty that we are going to face in sorting out what goes on here, which is why it's critical that the public get the opportunity to examine all the data that is being used to develop a plan and get to question those who put forward that data in an open hearing. We need to go into this with our eyes open. All the information on the table for public review and assessment. Let's be humble. I know that's tough. I know it's really tough, but previous projections have regularly been wrong. And I'm just going to do a little trip down memory lane for those who may not have been deeply scarred by this information already. In 1976, man, I was a young guy then, Ontario Hydro was projecting a 7% annual growth in electrical demand and calling for a vast building program of new power plants. 1976. None of the plants they called for in that year were ever built. Zero. Peak power demand 2 decades later, in 1997, was 22,000 megawatts, not the 57,000 that Hydro had predicted. So they were a bit off. You know, they were tens of billions of dollars off in their projection of what we needed to spend. I want to say to people, 10 billion here, 20 billion there, 30 billion over there. After a while, you're talking real money, and it shows up on people's hydro bills. So that was 76. 1989, let's go forward. All of that's sort of forgotten. Ontario Hydro called for an aggressive program to build new power plants, as they had in 76. Hydro was forecasting that peak demand would track economic growth at 2.5% per year and top 35,000 megawatts by 2014, 50% above its 1989 level. What happened? In 2014, peak demand was lower than it was in 1989 when the plan was hatched. So 2 occasions when, what I would say were pretty bright minds, got the numbers wrong dramatically. 2005, I want to say to all of you, the Liberals actually decided to go whole hog. The newly formed Ontario Power Authority forecast that peak demand for electricity would start growing nearly twice as fast as it had over the previous 15 years, reaching 30,000 megawatts by 2025. Worried that a gap might develop between supply and demand, the government expedited approval of new gas power plants, and we all know how that went. I actually had the opportunity. I don't know if the member from Renfrew-Nipissing was on the committee as well, and if he wasn't on it, he was certainly around for the gas plant inquiry. And we got a chance. Those were the good days, my friend. Those were the good days. Anyway, we were dealing with a $1 billion scandal for 2 gas-fired power plants that the Liberals had commissioned with the argument that if they weren't built, lights would go out in Oakville and the west end of the GTA. Now, as you know, those plants were never built there. We've put out about $1 billion. The plants were built in Napanee and down in Windsor. And frankly, the power crunch the Liberals were projecting at that time didn't appear. In fact, in 2023, and I looked it up last night, and I thank my teacher who taught me how to read and use a computer, the top demand day in 2023 was 23,713 megawatts, slightly above where we were in 1997. So I urge everyone in this room to be cautious. We have to be sensible. If you don't build enough capacity, there is a real problem. We all know that. But if you overbuild, and we've lived it through our wallets and our purses, we've lived it through the bills that have landed through the mail slot, it's awfully pricey. So, the government is basing its approach on the independent electricity system operator, and they're forecasting a dramatic increase in peak demand by 2050 for Ontario to successfully decarbonize its economy. And I think decarbonizing the economy makes tons of sense. It's critical for us. And they could be right. But if we look at predictions in the past, we have to be humble about our ability to project. Now, the ISO puts the price tag at meeting that demand at about $400 billion. And it's the only number we've got. We haven't had one from the government on its electricity plan. But if you look at the vision paper that the previous energy minister put out, and you look at the ISO plan, there's a lot of overlap. So let's say in the $400 billion range over the next 27 years. Now that's just for the big generating plants. I'm not talking the transmission lines that take that power across Ontario. If you've gone out on the 401, out to Clarington, you see those big transmission lines. If you go past Pickering, you see the big transmission lines. If you go to southwestern Ontario, you'll see those big transmission lines. I want to tell you right now, they're not cheap. They are pricey pieces of hardware. And so if you're talking about a big ramp-up of the electricity system, everyone out there who owns a wallet today could well find it thinner and lighter in the future if we get it wrong. $100 billion here, $100 billion there, soon you're talking real money. So it stands to reason that the shift to electric vehicles and heat pumps will add new electricity consumption to the system. That makes sense to me. Although it's interesting, the EV manufacturers and EV charging station suppliers have been to committee in the past, and they predicted a fairly small increase in the need for capacity because they said, look, you have huge overcapacity overnight, so we can charge these at night. You actually aren't going to have to build a lot more electrical generating capacity. And maybe they're right. But we need to know that there is a transition going on, not just in generation, but also in how businesses use power, how homeowners use power. And that transition in the past has led to tremendous reduction in the need for new power. And I'll just say LED lights. LED lights swept through North America, dramatically reducing demand. I used to be on Toronto City Council. I don't know what sins I committed, but that's where I wound up for a while. And I sat on a committee dealing with the conversion of the street lighting system from old incandescent to LEDs, which in the 90s were pretty cutting edge. And it was very clear that the reduction in power was going to be dramatic. And that had a big positive impact on the City of Toronto's operating budget, but it also changed the environment in which you do power planning. And as the price of power goes up, the cost or the attractiveness of investments that reduce your power consumption also go up. And so you have these two things happening all the time. Be very careful when you predict power demand for the future. And when you overpredict, you pay through the nose. So, we're developing those technologies globally, but I'm not seeing in this plan to make a plan, and let's be clear, this is not an electricity plan, this is a framework to write a plan, and that framework is profoundly flawed. So what we need, given what I've said to you all about the difficulty in predicting the future and the need for the public to be able to intervene, is we need to be very careful about where we're going, and we need a government that keeps the focus on affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And affordability, it's affected by a variety of things, not just the generation technology, but as I've said, all the wires to support it, all the transformer stations, all the staff you need. There's no indication in this document, this plan to make a plan, that in fact the government will assess the evidence, put forward a plan, and allow the public and stakeholders to question the government's assumptions at a public hearing. The Liberals never allowed that. And for those who had the pleasure of sitting with me in Estimates Committee, I would go after Liberal ministers on this. And again, the member from Renfrew-Nipissing, let's say he wasn't a pussycat in those estimates meetings. I know it's a shock to some members of that caucus, but he was not the shy introvert that you know from social events. I'm just trying to make a point that in those meetings he really came into his own. He was the man that you would expect he would be. Oh no, I won't go there. I wouldn't say he was right, but I would say he was aggressive. The Liberals wouldn't put their plans out for public scrutiny and examination. They would not let that happen. So if you're actually going to be making investments in the hundreds of billions of dollars, you need to actually have an opportunity for the public to question those who put together the estimates. I'll go back. Last year, the Ontario Energy Board, the body that regulates the rates that you pay for gas and electricity, had hearings about Enbridge. And this was a very substantial hearing because, as you're all well aware, the world is shifting, and increasingly we are not going to be using gas. Just as we moved away from coal, we're moving away from gas. And Enbridge presented a report by some very high-priced and, generally speaking, reputable consultants showing that it was cheaper to take on climate change by burning gas than making more electricity, which was a pretty strange report. And because there was an opportunity to actually go through the numbers and question those who were pulling it together, it was found that the report that was before the board was fundamentally flawed mathematically and in terms of understanding how energy systems work. And unprecedented in my knowledge, the board ordered Enbridge to have the report rewritten so that it actually reflected reality. And if you don't have a public hearing where the public stakeholders can question those who put forward a report, then your ability to determine what's true and what's false is dramatically cut. And I'll say to all of you, if you're paying a big bill now, if you're having trouble covering your expenses now, you want scrutiny on spending in a way that would satisfy you that, yes, something has to be spent. Or you want scrutiny that will show it doesn't have to be spent and you don't have to deal with a bigger bill. I think that's the least one can do. But This government says they're committed to affordability, and when you hear that, my friends, grab your wallets and make sure no one else's hand is in your pocket. They say they're committed to affordability, but the bill itself says the minister may, not shall, may consider affordability in developing his plan. Well, you got to be kidding me. May consider affordability? I thought the title of the act was all about that, and yet it's not required in the act. And so I asked the minister about that yesterday, and it was very impressive. He danced around, he shimmied, he shook, but he didn't say, yes, you're right, affordability must be part of the plan. It should be a requirement in writing the plan. Not there. If you're concerned about paying bills, don't you think the government should say that it's mandatory in writing the plan that affordability is one of the focuses? But it is not. It is not in this bill. We also need to focus on reliability. Now, there are a lot of threats to power getting from a power plant to your home. A lot of threats to the ability to turn on the lights, your television, put the kettle on, whatever. We've got inadequate generation as a potential threat. You've got cyber failures and cyber attacks. You've got equipment that's aging, possibly failing. But the thing that's not mentioned in this plan, to make a plan, is adapting to climate impacts. And first of all, I think everyone in this room agrees, maybe someone can surprise me, but I think everyone agrees the world's weather is changing fast, and decisively it's getting worse. And so last year, the Ontario Energy Board actually put together a plan. They had London Economics International do a study for them, and they themselves wrote a study based on that, on how do we adjust to, how do we live with this new climate that we're living in. And I think it's worth looking at some of what they had to say. I think it's worth looking at what they had to say. So they noted some recent weather events in Ontario that caught people's attention. In May of 2022, a derecho brought winds of 190 kilometers an hour to the Ottawa-Gatineau region, knocked out thousands of trees, left 180,000 homes and other buildings served by Hydro Ottawa without power. Some of the outages lasted for days. Well, the people from Ottawa can speak to this at greater detail than I can. And they can talk about it, I'm sure, with greater emotional depth than I can, because they were either living with it or dealing with constituents whose lives have been upended by it. September 21st, 2018, 6 tornadoes touched down in or near the National Capital Region. When did Ottawa show up in Kansas? I mean, I have no idea how they moved that whole city down to Kansas, but that's what we got. The strongest had estimated wind speeds of up to 265 kilometers an hour. Others, 220 kilometers. Others, up to 177 kilometers. Over 300,000 customers, Ottawa, Gatineau, Eastern Ontario, were without power. According to the Canadian Disaster Database, the estimated total costs attributed were approximately $334 million. So the OEB sort of set the stage with, yeah, you can expect very powerful storms that will take out the electricity system. In Canada, insured catastrophic losses have risen from around $456 million per year over the late 1900s and early 2000s to routinely exceeding $2 billion per year. And I want to say to you, you may think that the climate crisis is distant and not affecting you, because no tornado has gone through your front yard recently. But you pay higher insurance rates, because when insurance companies put out billions, they recover that money from their whole customer base. That is consequential. People have seen the reports on Hurricanes Milton and Helene going through Florida, going through North Carolina, and if you actually take YouTube and take a look at some of the news stories on American television in the southern part of Florida, you will see that those people are paying, the ones who can get insurance, paying very, very high rates. Because if you haven't been hit, your insurance company will come after you nonetheless to help make up the losses where they have been hit. North American market is affected by those losses. The Canadian insurance market is affected by those losses. So the next time you get an insurance bill that you think, hey, what's going on here? Some of it may well be profiteering, but some of it is the impact of climate change. So that's happening, and Natural Resources Canada reported in August of 2022 that Canada's climate is warming at a rate about twice that of the global average. Climate model projections show that this will continue, and it will increase the risks that we face in our daily lives and in our economy. Now, the OEB, which has provided all this information, reports that the electricity sector is one of the sectors most at disruption from climate change. That's our nervous system. People in this room, well, maybe the pages weren't around in 2003, but the rest of you were around with the big power outage in 2003. Life was upended in this part of the world. Life was upended. When you're talking about the nervous system of a society, you're talking about the oxygen line of a society, and in a hospital, it's literally the oxygen line. You have to worry about how that change is going to affect the delivery of electricity to you and your family. And so we need to take steps to protect ourselves against it. The OEB talks about a variety of direct and indirect impacts of climate change on our system. But I have to say, this plan to make a plan does not include addressing the whole question of adapting to the new world we live in. And that is a major failing. Because if you're talking about how the electricity system operates, how it operated 10 years ago, 20 years, 30 years ago, is no longer a guide, because we're going into a different reality. When you go from Toronto to Montreal, Montreal is a very nice city, but it's a different place. Different driving, different restaurants, great place actually, but we are not in the place we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. We are going into a world of far more extreme weather. And we have not paid attention to it. I have to say, the Liberals talked a lot about climate. But when we had the big ice storm in 2013, and we had, in my riding, people without power for weeks, there was never, that I've been able to get, nor has the Legislative Library been able to get, a follow-up study of what happened and what should have been done. And it was promised at the time, but to my knowledge, there was no follow-up study. In some places, like California, recognizing the impact on their power system, they are starting to put their power lines underground, which is an awfully expensive thing to do. And you want to look at other things before you do that, because it's about $8 million a kilometer. And we have many thousands of kilometers of power lines in this province. When the OEB looked at how you would deal with this different world, they talked about protecting key communication systems. They talked about replacing the aging infrastructure so it would have a better chance of surviving extreme weather. They talked about the need for small local grids so that people would have some local protection. And in fact, I had the opportunity earlier this year with a number of my colleagues to present a bill to have the government facilitate and fund the development of local grids, not only because as technology evolves it would produce cheaper power, but also to ensure that people had reliability, protection in extreme weather. And that is something that needs to happen. Even the Ontario Energy Board thinks that that is something that would help us in a crisis. And they also say that we need energy efficiency to maintain livable conditions for longer periods. And they're right. People in North Carolina took a while to get power back on. People in Florida, in the course of those, in the area where those hurricanes hit, they were without power for a long time. We're going to need to do that if we're going to want to protect ourselves and our families in the years to come. So, that is something that needs to be tended to. It is not in this plan to make a plan. It is not addressed. It doesn't make any reference to climate adaptation. So, there are a few things I've noted that aren't here. Transparency, a commitment to affordability, and taking account of adaptation. If you're going to have a serious plan, it needs to shift our production of electricity to non-emitting sources and stop over-reliance on gas as we confront the impacts of climate change. Now, this is an integrated plan, or so it says, so it's covering gas and electricity, and I assume other forms of energy. We need to use this plan to help deliver on our climate targets, because we know that as the world gets hotter, our standard of living is going to be dropping. It's going to be harder to bring in crops. It's going to be harder to get goods moved around the world. We're going to spend more on infrastructure that's damaged and homes that are damaged, other buildings that are damaged. This government has its own orphan climate plan that in court, when they're challenged on it, they sort of disavow it. Yeah, we put it forward, but it really is of no legal consequence. To not actually say in the plan that you are going to use our energy system, which is going to be central to this task, to meet our climate targets, is a gross loss of an opportunity. More than loss of an opportunity, it is a dereliction of duty. And I think when you look at the government's plan to expand gas plants in Ontario, that is a huge problem. And when you look at this plan, you're not seeing the commitment to reducing the use of gas. A few years ago, the Electricity Distributors Association, you know, Toronto Hydro, Hydro Ottawa, I think it was Peterborough Public Utility Commission, are all members of the Electricity Distributors Association, put together a report, sent it to the government saying, you're about to invest major bucks in new gas plants, and you can deliver the electricity services that are needed at a much lower cost by investing in conservation. And the Electricity Distributors Association got to cite the provincial electricity system operator saying, yeah, it's a lot cheaper to do this, and the investment in conservation has been very effective at reliably meeting our needs in this province. That proposal, that plan was ignored by the government. So why the government is listing gas as an option for the plan, while the reality is that we already have about a quarter of our system, quarter of our capacity is gas plants, why you would be expanding that in the face of what's going on with the climate, when you look at the financial needs that people in this province have, the affordability crunch they're dealing with, why you wouldn't take the cheaper option is beyond me. Not just cheaper, effective. And, you know, while I'm here, I'll just note as well that the rest of the world, which is suffering substantial damage from the climate crisis, is changing the way they deal with carbon. The European Union is bringing in what they call a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So if you're not reducing carbon use in your country or region, then you pay a penalty to sell goods into the European Union. So if we want access to markets, we have to show concretely that we're reducing our carbon use, our carbon consumption. The European Union is entirely right to do that, and their pilot plan is on around aluminum, iron, steel, cement, fertilizers. Now, I don't know how much of those things we send to the European Union, but given that other countries are starting to look at this, including the United Kingdom, Turkey, Australia, if we want to trade internationally, we have to get serious about reducing our emissions. And when you omit that from this plan, what you're saying to Canadian workers in manufacturing and heavy industry is, well, you know what? we're just going to hope for the best. It says that you don't have a plan to make sure that you can access those markets in the years to come. That is a substantial problem. That is a substantial problem. Now, I've already talked about climate adaptation and costs. I also want to note that the Financial Accountability Officer releases a report on budget impacts of climate hazards to public infrastructure in Ontario. And although the report is fascinating, and although I know everyone in this room wants to hear every word that was written, I'll just pick out the highlights. And that's that in the absence, we have about $708 billion in infrastructure in Ontario that's vulnerable to climate hazards. And if we don't invest to adapt to the extreme weather that's coming, so that bridges don't get washed out, highways don't get washed out, that electricity lines aren't taken down by high winds, then we're looking at adding about $4.1 billion per year on average to maintain our existing public infrastructure. $4 billion. You notice that, right, in a budget? It's not $5 million, $4.1 billion. So we can invest now to make our infrastructure more resilient, hardier, but frankly, Speaker, if you're not taking the opportunity, when you're dealing with a major system like electricity, to make that system or help that system enable us to get to our climate goals, even though they're inadequate in Ontario, you are not being responsible with the public purse. You're not being responsible to those people out there who are struggling every day to pay their bills, every month to pay their rent or pay their mortgage. Those people are having their lives set aside. So, next thing I want to say, when it comes to large infrastructure projects, this government's track record raises serious questions, not only on performance, but on transparency and financial accountability. And does it ever? I can't say it more because I can't say it often enough, but I sat in committees with Liberal energy ministers and watched Liberals in other circumstances, and frankly, this government is just following their lead. I mean, I don't know what it is. Is it the water supply on the other side of the chamber? Is it something genetic? Who knows? But the Liberal approach is one that this government seems to have taken on and embraced and enjoyed. In my riding, and in a few other ridings, the Ontario line, and by the way, Speaker, we need these subways. You know how congested the streets are in this city. It can get pretty rough. So we need the investment. But that project was sold as a $9 billion expenditure. And in fact, when the Premier brought it in, he said, okay, the city was going to spend $6-8 billion on a relief line, or a subway line from Pape Station to the downtown. But for a few billion more, we can get 15 kilometers of line. Well, as you may well be aware, that line is now costing about $20 billion. They actually, overlooked $10 billion of expenses. Or the Eglinton Crosstown. I have to say, Speaker, I had the opportunity to deal with the City of Toronto on their relief line, and I had a chance to deal with the province on the Ontario line. And with the relief line, constant public meetings, a lot of data, so that we could critique what was going on. And frankly, in the end, at least in my riding, although people weren't fully happy, those people who had a tunnel going under their house weren't fully happy. They understood the logic, and they went with it. With the Ontario line, when I would question a decision and I'd say, what's the cost comparison, I could not get the costs. I was told, oh, it's more. Well, how much? These are public accounts. This is public money. Why doesn't the public get a chance to actually critique what's going on there? I have to say, Speaker, that is an approach that we see on the ground today that is being perpetuated again in this bill. And I just mentioned Eglinton Crosstown one more. It seems to be in semi-permanent limbo. The opening date, state secret. I don't know how they keep it as secret as they do. I'm sure there's surveillance of the vault that the data is kept in, but you can't find out. The provincial agency is not upfront about issues. And frankly, Speaker, in that, they simply reflect the approach that is taken by their masters. So I'm going to explore that a bit further in this speech. I know I'm starting to run out of time, and I've got so much more. But this bill is actually about reducing transparency. The previous Liberal ministers who worked really hard not to answer questions, who in estimates would be aggressive in saying, I can't answer that. In fact, in one meeting we had, Todd Smith was there, former energy minister. We were asking about the sale of Ontario Hydro. And the energy minister had a lawyer sitting beside him, and every so often I'd ask a question and the lawyer would dig into the energy minister's ribs and I wouldn't get an answer. But that's nothing. They were minor players, because I'd say this government is moving into the big leagues with not being open about what's going on. I think we should all recognize, with the right energy plan, grounded in evidence, with transparency, with the expertise of workers in our energy sector in Ontario, we can ensure our province has the energy we need for a thriving economy and a low-carbon, no-carbon future. We're not short of smarts or skills in this province. We have an energy sector very broad, with the intelligence, the training, and the planning to meet our needs, second to none globally. But in order to do that, we're going to need to give them a plan and a direction that makes sense. We can ensure a much richer economy. We spend today somewhere between 15 and 20 billion a year importing oil and gas and coal. 15 to 20 billion a year. The money goes to Pennsylvania. The money goes to probably Saskatchewan and Alberta. That comes out of our economy. And if we were to take that cash flow and put it into Ontario to power this province, then we would have a much more robust economy. Something we did at the beginning of the 20th century when we developed hydropower in Ontario, renewable power, is that we developed the expertise to export engineering staff and knowledge globally. We were seen as a leader, and we could have done that with the current generation of energy production. We're not seeing it in this particular jurisdiction, in this particular regime. When we, in the New Democrats, developed our Green New Democratic deal before the last election, we were looking at what it would take to actually build out a green system, to actually invest in people's homes and businesses, to dramatically reduce their use of energy so that their bills would be stabilized at a lower level, so that they wouldn't have the same problems with emissions, so that in a crisis they would be in a position to ride out extreme cold weather or extreme hot weather. And the reality in this province is that you would have labor power demands that you'd have to really work on meeting. We have a potential in this province to eliminate the import of oil and gas and put hundreds of thousands of people to work. People who are already working in energy could go further. People who are historically excluded from the labor force would have an opportunity to take part in a variety of well-paid, high-skilled jobs. That's, Speaker, something that we need to do. I'm not seeing that in this bill. I'm not seeing the commitment to a transformation of our energy system. And I'm not seeing, even more importantly, frankly, the ability of the public to examine and question the evidence the government says it's operating on. And without that, and it doesn't matter what stripe the government is, the public is going to have real problems. So, bill takes us in the wrong direction when it comes to transparency and depoliticizing our energy planning decisions. We've seen the problems with the Liberals of politicized energy policies from previous governments. And again, with the government cutting out any hearings before the Ontario Energy Board, real problems. The bill would be much more clearly labelled and understood if it was called simply the Just Trust Us Energy Bill 2024. And that I think would express the actual heart of the bill and would be far better understood by people in Ontario. And I would say to all of you, why is it that people in Ontario may not trust this government and this premier? And I'm going to expand on this further if I have enough time, but I just want to note, I'll cite the Greenbelt as the first. 2018, the premier running for office told a room of developers that he'd open up a big chunk of the Greenbelt for home building. And when that was revealed, the premier pivoted, understanding that he'd put his foot in his mouth up to his knee, and he made an unequivocal promise, we won't touch the Greenbelt. And then he repeated that commitment through his first term. And then in November 2022, the Ford government changed its mind and removed 7,400 acres from the Greenbelt slated for housing development. So how do you have trust in a premier who only lives up to a commitment when there's a Mountie investigation going on? There are a lot of reasons to not just sign on to a Just Trust Me 2024 energy bill. I think there are reasons to go to committee and try and change this bill. I think that would actually be a useful forum both for debate and hopefully for the government to see some reason and put transparency in the bill. Require that affordability be a central part of the plan. Not just may be part of the plan. Require that considerations of affordability be there. This is the government that is proposing to build a tunnel under Highway 401. Yeah. You got to be kidding me. Yeah, seriously, you got to be. When I first heard it, I thought, okay, he's talking off the cuff. He's at a stand-up comedy venue, and he's decided to get whatever yucks he can by saying something that no one would believe any serious politician would say. But apparently, I didn't understand what was going on. Premier is seriously proposing something that he won't give a price for. I'll say he did say that we would do a feasibility study and then said, well, we're going to build it anyway. So I guess the feasibility study was more like putting the ribbon on the package. It didn't actually change the contents, but it might be prettier. Those instances of not being able to trust the premier says to me, this bill, man, you should not trust what's being put forward. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. And you know what? Ronnie was right. You got to do that. And if you're going to come forward and say, I'm doing this, well, give me the means by which I can verify that you're telling me the truth, that your evidence is actually consequential. It isn't full of holes. It isn't Swiss cheese like the report that Enbridge brought to the Ontario Energy Board that was shredded and that had to be rewritten. The cost, the reliability, sustainability of energy affects every person in this province. And it's the difference between making our household budgets work and not work. It can't be driven by a bill that limits public access to information and effectively eliminates potential for the public to have any input in our energy future. Just as the government changed the whole system of regulating gas with Bill 165, effectively ending regulation by a tribunal in Ontario. This bill takes the public out of the process. This becomes a far more lobbyist-driven planning process. That, Speaker, is not a good thing. Now, I'm starting to get low on time. I can see that, and I won't ask for an extension this time. The Liberals vastly overbuilt the power system when they were in power, and we've all paid. We're paying what? $7.3 billion a year in electricity subsidies now? I mean, what we're paying in electricity subsidies makes the Ministry of Energy one of the big ministries in Ontario. It's not education, it's not health, but boy, it isn't the 400 or 500 million it used to be. 7.3 billion is a lot of subsidy dollars. And I'm not seeing in this plan to make a plan that actually is going to be addressed. So, I want to go, in the time I have left, to some detail of the bill. Schedule 1 amends the Electricity Act to promote electrification and facilitate energy-efficient measures aimed at using electricity to reduce overall emissions in Ontario. Now, as I said earlier, electrification makes sense. That's where the world's going. We don't burn coal to heat our houses anymore. In the future, we aren't going to be using baseboard heaters, electric resistance baseboard heaters, because they're so wasteful. Technology's changed. We have the ability to dramatically cut our electricity use, make our homes warm, and not use gas. So I have to ask, if the government is committed to electrification, why did we pass a bill to protect Enbridge's plans to expand the gas system? So on the one hand, we're saying we're going to electrify everything. On the other, we're saying we're going to increase the number of houses that use gas. Which story is true? Is the government actually thinking that they're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on new power plants that won't be needed because we have more gas in our houses? One thing I have to note, in Germany, because of their experience with Russia not being a reliable supplier of gas, more and more people are switching away from gas to electric heat pumps. That is setting in motion a dynamic for those who remain with the gas system seeing higher and higher bills because fewer and fewer people are paying for the pipes in the ground. What the government is proposing is that fewer and fewer people will be using gas, or they're spending hundreds of billions to no purpose. And at the same time, they're sticking the existing gas customers with bills that they're going to have trouble paying in the future. In an integrated plan, what is the government planning to do to protect those who remain on gas over the next few decades? In New England, there are some states that are now integrating the planning between the gas grid and the electricity grid, so that as gas users come away from that system, the gas lines are shut down, electricity is provided, and things are done smoothly, not in a jagged way that causes financial problems for the customers on both sides. Is the government proposing to do that? I guess we'll find out. But if you're talking about an integrated plan and actually electrifying everything, then you have to have in the plan what that means to look after those who are still gas customers. Now, this is the one that was striking. Well, there are a number of things that were striking, as you may have gathered from my remarks to this point. The minister may, but not shall, institute or issue an integrated energy resource plan, setting out and balancing the government's goals and objectives that may respect various listed energy matters. This replaces the existing requirement that the minister produce a long-term energy plan. Well, it's interesting to me that we're debating a bill where production of a plan is actually optional. It doesn't say the minister shall issue an integrated energy resource plan, which is sort of what you would expect if you were doing energy planning for this major part of Canada. Why do we not require a plan? Maybe the minister doesn't want to be tied down to a plan. Maybe he wants to just fly by the seat of his pants. You know, I had a lobbyist come in and see, the minister may say, I had a lobbyist come in and see me. It was a good story. I think we should put the bucks there. And if I have a plan, well, that might tie me down. It makes sense to have an integrated plan, but if it makes sense, Speaker, it should be something that's not just optional for the minister, it's something that the minister must do. The bill goes on. The minister is required to launch a consultation on a new plan within 5 years of the issuance of the previous plan, if one is issued. But it's not clear whether the minister is actually required to issue a subsequent plan. It doesn't require it. And I have to say, the Liberals ignored their long-term energy plan system. Their system would have required hearings. They ignored that. We went after them on it. As everyone in this room is well aware, actually adhering to their own laws, their own bills, was not something they were really hot on, and this government seems to have the same approach. I don't know why they wouldn't do this. I mean, the logic dictates that you would actually require a plan. And maybe it's just, again, as I was saying, they want to make sure they've got the freedom to satisfy the most recent lobbyist who's come into the room. Note that the existing requirement that this be a long-term plan is removed. We will see. The Section 25.29.2, I know you all need to know the exact number, of the current Electricity Act lists various energy matters that may, but not shall, be covered in the energy plan, including cost-effectiveness, reliability, use of cleaner sources. This bill makes various changes to this list, including consumer affordability, enhancement of energy infrastructure to support economic growth, and cost-effective procurement. Again, the items that may be covered don't include climate adaptation. So next time you're freezing in the dark and wondering, will the power ever come on? Maybe you'll have the opportunity to experience what people in Florida got to experience, and that's sweating through the night with the food rotting in their refrigerator and wondering when or if the power is going to come on. So, the bill doesn't include meeting our climate goals, and that, given the climate damage we face, is a huge omission. It also gets rid of making efficiency and conservation the first step, the priority. And, Speaker, yesterday, the minister in his opening remarks said the cheapest way to provide electrical services, the cheapest kilowatt is the one you don't have to generate. And you know what? The minister was right. Now, you can't meet 100% of our electricity needs through energy conservation or efficiency. You just can't. You do have to produce power. But the starting point of any plan that is affordable is to make sure that the cheapest option is the foundational stone, the starting point, and then you go on after that. If the government were to say, okay, in the process of setting this plan, we're going to first determine what's the least expensive source of power that meets our other needs around reliability and sustainability. But that isn't in here either. So you really have to ask, how are you going to make it affordable if affordability is not cooked in right at the beginning? Now, this bill, oh my goodness, time is short and so much to say. The current Act requires the ISO to publish a technical report on the adequacy and reliability of electricity resources prior to launching consultations on the energy plan. The minister shall publish other information such as key data and cost projections, but only if the minister determines that this information should be made publicly available. And I think I'll wrap up there. If it's what the minister thinks should be available rather than what the public needs to make a determination as to whether or not something's going to work and is affordable, that is a profound problem. This bill does not, as its title might indicate, actually help people with higher bills. And frankly, you hear the word affordability mentioned 20 or 30 times, because it's nice to say it. If people hear the words, they often think something's being done. But just because someone says something doesn't mean it's necessarily the case. And that's the problem we face here. Repeating something lots of times doesn't actually mean that something's being done in the area that you're concerned about. So I'd say, Speaker, this Just Trust Us Bill 2024 has profound flaws. I think in committee it would be worth having debate about them. Hopefully the government would amend so that they overcome some of the worst sins visited upon the province by the Liberals and actually bring forward a plan that's useful. If they don't amend it profoundly, Speaker, this is not going to lead to electricity people can afford. It's going to lead to electricity that will make life far more difficult for them. Speaker, with that, I thank you.